but UNITA would make its stand here, in the countryside. And although Jonas Savimbi was supported by the majority of the Angolan people, they stood alone. UNITA was overlooked by the Americans.
Nobody knew much about Savimbi. Savimbi didn't hit the international cocktail circuit the way FNLA and MPLA activists and leaders did. Savimbi stayed in Angola tending to his business.
The program began in July. By early August, I had been brought up and was putting my staff together, and we inside the CIA didn't know who our players were and the geography and whatnot. Savimbi was an afterthought. We really hadn't ever met him until August of '75, until the thing was actually already moving. And then we found he had a history of not being sympathetic to the United States, but he found himself odd man out. He found himself with no backers. The MPLA had gotten support, the commitment from the Russians and then from the Cubans, and the FNLA had the United States and Red China supplying it with arms. And Savimbi was odd man out. I found UNITA's forces not well armed. They didn't have boots, for example. But the great hope that I saw there was a commitment, a willingness to die. If you're in a military situation, this is an essential ingredient, however gory it might be. But also a quality of integrity and charisma on the part of Savimbi, the leader.
Savimbi had the manpower. He had the young men who would go out and fight. What he didn't have were guns. He didn't have logistics capability. He didn't have armor. He didn't have communications. All of those he was able to get from the South Africans in the form of a very small number, a few hundred men, and a few dozen vehicles. That combination was able to defeat Soviet equipment, Soviet advisors, and Cuban manpower on a better than one-to-one basis.
After the battle for Luanda, the FNLA was decimated and ceased to be a viable force. The Americans found themselves drawn into support for UNITA and an association with South Africa.
South Africa's interest in Angola was their own interest to stop the MPLA from gaining power, to stop the Cubans. But at a different level, they were delighted to become involved with the United States to seduce us into a situation of military involvement with them, which they hoped would eventually trap us in a position where we would have to publicly support them in a military venture in Africa. This would commit us to overt support to their policies. The United States finessed this point and drew back and actually gave up and accepted a defeat in Angola rather than taking that step.
The Angolan conflict escalated rapidly, exposing CIA activities. Questions arose, first in the media, then in Congress. In a post-Vietnam isolationist mood, an angry U.S. Senate passed the Clark Amendment, prohibiting further American intervention in Angola.
The Senate voted against U.S. involvement, thinking that we were, in the words of one of them, backing the wrong horse. Actually, we were backing the right horse. We were backing the group that had the majority support of the Angolan people, and we were backing the group that was actually winning the war. The Senate really snatched defeat from the jaws of victory.
The Clark Amendment sealed UNITA's fate. For the second time that year, America abandoned an ally. Without U.S. backing, South Africa withdrew its forces, and UNITA was left to face the full might of Soviet, Cuban, and MPLA forces. Overwhelmed, UNITA retreated on foot from its stronghold in the fertile highlands of central Angola to the forbidding barrens, known as the end of the world. For 4 months, battered by daily attacks, ravaged by starvation and disease, UNITA's barefoot forces dwindled and then seemed to vanish into the trackless forests. On the first anniversary of Angolan independence, the MPLA announced UNITA's extinction. Temporarily secure from internal strife, the MPLA began to consolidate its power under President Agostinho Neto. The Portuguese withdrawal had left Angola with a tentative economic infrastructure. Forced to rely heavily on Soviet support, NATO began to centralize and nationalize to match the Soviet model. East Germans began to organize Angola's repressive security apparatus, and other East Bloc advisors flooded into Luanda in an attempt to stabilize the situation. But despite these measures, the economy collapsed further. NATO, beginning to waver in his enthusiasm for Soviet policies, looked to the West for alternatives to Angola's total dependence on the East Bloc. But in 1979, before he was able to establish any economic ties with the West, he died.
Viva o camarada presidente José Eduardo dos Santos! Viva o camarada presidente José Eduardo dos Santos!
His replacement was Eduardo dos Santos, handpicked by Moscow and educated in the Soviet Union. Dos Santos moved Angola closer to a regime committed to Soviet-style socialism, further tightening Moscow's hold on the MPLA. But the economy never recovered.